Okay, class, in this lecture we're going to cover Chapter 17, which is the chapter covering economic growth. This will be probably a shorter lecture, I think, and the chapter itself and the homework will be shorter. There'll be a few questions on your next quiz, on your next exam about this chapter, but it's probably not the beefiest in terms of content that'll be contained on your quiz or exam. But in another sense, it's probably the most important chapter of the semester, in that its object is the most important thing we're trying to achieve in economics, and that's economic growth. Okay, so we're going to introduce the topic a little bit first, and then we're going to talk about the two types of sustainable growth that we can see in an economy. And then lastly, we will talk a little bit about the difference between a slowdown and a recession, and conclude with a discussion about new growth theory. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started and introduce the topic a little bit. So we're talking about economic growth, which again is a very important topic, because economic growth, remember what we're talking about, growth and production. Economic growth and production is the cause of increased standard of living. Okay? If you want to see increases in the standard of living, you need to see increases in production growth. That's what leads to increases in standards of living. I would argue that this is the most important fact about in terms of understanding why standards of living have increased so dramatically in the last 150 years, is understanding economic growth and its underlying causes. Okay. Now, we've experienced unprecedented in human history, unprecedented levels of economic growth worldwide, but particularly in the United States over the last 150 years. Okay, it's just been amazing. I mean, if you think about life in the year, 100 AD, the typical person got from point A to B by walking or taking a horse. They probably cooked their food on an open flame. They heated themselves in the cold with an open flame, and had a pretty meager existence. Just getting by with the basics. Most people. Well, that same fact was probably true in the year 1000. It was still true in the year 1500. In the year 1500, most people got around by walking or horseback. Most people cooked their food on an open flame. Most people heated their wherever they lived with an open flame. They had a pretty meager existence. But by the year 2000, by the year 2020, I mean, it's unrecognizable in human history. Somebody from just 300, 200 years ago transported to our time would just be in awe. It would almost seem like a different world. And the cause of this huge change in our standard of living is economic growth and production. Okay? Now, I can't emphasize this next point enough, but economic growth is not inevitable. It's not like we stumbled upon something that we can't lose. Okay, we're going to talk about the specific causes of growth and potential GDP here in a minute, but there's some basic building blocks you need to have in order to have an economy where increases in resources or technology are going to lead to increased output. Okay, so just like anything that grows, it's going to need the right conditions. So some absolute basics for economic growth. Well, one is the rule of law. Okay, you have to be able to institute rules that promote growth, and you have to be able to enforce those rules. You can't have lawlessness. Okay, you have to be able to enforce rules. The most important rule to be able to enforce is the protection of, for economic growth, is the protection of private property rights. It's been known for millennia, since the beginning of human existence, and pointed out by people thousands of years ago, like Aristotle, that people care for and develop the best those things which they own themselves. Those things that we own collectively, we don't nearly take as well care of, and we don't develop as much because there's no incentive to. Okay, so people have to have private property rights. Those private property rights have to be protected by the rule of law. Okay, if I can develop something that will produce something faster, and you can just steal it from me with no repercussion, there's no reason for me to develop it. I'm going to invest in having a car lot, and rioters can just burn my car lot to the ground, and suffer no consequences, and offer me no way to be restored in my loss, I won't start a car lot. Okay, so this is basic. You have to have a rule of law. You have to be able to protect private property rights. In addition to that, you need to have incentives that promote production. Okay, a lot of our tax policy can either encourage production or discourage production. One I don't have on here, I probably should include, is the payroll tax. Payroll taxes are basically your Social Security taxes. Well, when you work for another business, like I work for EKU, or you work for whoever, I pay half of my payroll tax. The other half of my payroll tax is paid by my employer. Well, what if I was a self-employed plumber or electrician or HVAC person or auto mechanic or hairdresser or whatever else, a self-employed individual? You have to pay both parts of your payroll tax, the employer part and the employee part. Well, that could dissuade people from starting their own businesses. Okay, a lot of times we treat entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, we treat their earnings for their business just as income. Well, there's a whole lot of difference between me making whatever $50,000 a year, let's say, and let's say someone who owns their own hairdressing business making $50,000 a year. My $50,000 a year all goes to me, and I share it with my family. The $50,000 that goes to the hairdresser that owns their own shop, they want to put some of that money back into the business. They want to build their business. Treating it all as income is going to dissuade increases in production. Capital gains taxes are basically taxes on the investment in capital. We know increased amounts of capital will lead to increased production. Or if you're going to tax the investment in capital, you might get less investment in capital, less growth. Okay, we know that a lot of companies have moved offshore because of the corporate profit taxes in the United States. Now, in 2016, they were lowered, and that's helped repatriate some of these businesses, move them back to the United States. So the point here is you need to be careful with incentives. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the chapter, but incentives are very important to encourage people to produce, and produce at a high level. Okay? All right, how long does it take for real GDP or our standards of living to double? Okay? Well, we're going to talk briefly about something called the Rule of 70. Okay? And the Rule of 70 is not a special economics rule. It's a rule that you can use to see how long anything would double. Okay? But it's particularly useful in discussing economic growth. So the way the Rule of 70 works is you just take the number 70 and you divide it by your growth rate in whatever it is you're looking at that's growing. You could look at the rate of growth of a plant, and they'll tell you how long it takes for a plant to double. You could look at the rate of growth in your children to tell them how long it would take them to double in size, or how long an economy could grow. Okay, So we said, sustainable growth in an economy is 3 to 5%. Well, if the economy grows at 3%, 70 divided by 3 equals 23.3, if I did my math right. Okay? So if the economy grows at 3% per year, divide that 3 into 70, and it would take 23.3 years for the economy to double. What if we were on the higher end of that? Say 5% growth. Well, 70 divided by 5 equals 14. So it would take 14 years to double. See a big improvement here. Well, from 2008 to 2016, the growth rate in the economy was 1.5%. So 70 divided by 1.5 equals 46.6 years. In other words, if we continued growing at that 1.5% rate, your standard of living, or the average person's standard of living, would take 46.6 years to double. Your entire working life and beyond, really probably the rest of your life, right? So, or pretty close to it, okay? So your entire working career, it would take for you to double your standard of living. Whereas if we were growing at 3%, okay, your standard of living would double twice in your working career, okay? Or at 5%, almost 3 times, okay? So this slowdown in the growth rate that we experienced from 2008 to 2016 was really bad for our economy, okay? Now, from 2017 to today, we've been growing at about 2.53%. So 70 divided by 2.53, that's about 27.6 years. So, you might be tempted to say, wow, increasing from 1.5% to 2.5% isn't really a big deal. It is a big deal, okay? It cuts almost in half the amount of time it takes our standard of living to double. So imagine you start working and you're making $50,000 a year. Well, it'll take your whole lifetime for that $50,000 to feel like $100,000. But if we just grow a little bit more, halfway through your career, that $50,000 will feel like $100,000. And then at the end of your career, that $100,000 will feel like $200,000, right? Because it's doubled again, okay? From 1984 to 1988, okay, we grew at about 5.65%. So 70 divided by 5.65, that's going to double every 12.39 years. That was a roaring economy, okay? So the rule of 70 is just a way of estimating how long will it take for our standard of living to double. And growth rates like 1.5 can really change what happens in your lifetime compared to a growth rate like, say, 2.53%, okay? So this, what might not grab a headline on the nightly news, is huge, right? You're going to go from feeling like you make $50,000 a year to $100,000 a year in your working career, whereas in this situation, you go from feeling like you're making $50,000 a year to $200,000 a year by the end of your working career, or close to it, okay? So it makes a huge difference. All right, let's now talk about sustainable growth, okay? Remember, we talked at the very beginning of this class that there are there are three main goals for the economy, and the most important goal is to have high sustainable growth. Okay, and we've talked about growth in our previous chapters, and we've talked about achieving potential as our goal. But we want to now talk about that growth in potential or sustainable growth. Okay, so we're going to talk about two types of sustainable growth. The first one we've actually already done. Okay, we did this back in chapter 9. Okay, but just to review. Okay, this is going to be a move from below full employment to full employment. Remember, with a below full employment equilibrium, resources are underused, okay, because they're overpaid. Input prices are too high. They're fixed by contract, okay? But eventually, right, eventually contracts expire, right? So let's depict, and then we will hopefully see some sustainable growth. Okay, so let's depict this. Right, so let's say we got the U.S. economy, we got our short run aggregate supply curve, we got our aggregate demand curve, we have our short run equilibrium price level, P0, equilibrium quantity, Q0. And we're operating below potential, below full employment. So here's our long run aggregate supply curve. We can call this QN. Okay? We're underproducing, right? We're underproducing. Resources are underused because they're overpaid, right? And that's fixed by contract. But what did we say would eventually happen? Those contracts will expire and they'll be renegotiated, right? And the people who own resources say we want to be paid what we're worth or more. The people buying resources say we're willing to pay resources what they're worth or less. And we come to an agreement paying resources what they're worth. Well, if resources are currently overpaid, paying them what they're worth means we're going to decrease resource prices. If resource prices go down, firms can afford more resources. That'll shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right, to SRAS1, and we will achieve short run equilibrium on our long run aggregate supply curve, or long run equilibrium. And you might say, well, wait a minute, we're going to move exactly to potential? And the answer is yes, because the short run aggregate supply curve wouldn't overshift, because that would mean what? Resources are now underpaid and they're overused. We just signed a new contract. Would you sign a new contract intentionally making sure that you were underpaid? No, that's not reasonable. What about falling short, right? We just shift a little bit. Well, that wouldn't happen either. Why? Because that would mean the people who buy resources are voluntarily continuing to overpay them. So the only place that makes sense in the negotiation process is paying resources what they're worth, moving back to potential. So the price level will drop from P0 to P1, and quantity will increase from Q0 to the new Q1, but Q1 is equal to potential. So we had growth here, and that growth was from below full employment to full employment, so that's growth we can keep. You might recall in the video for chapter 8, where we didn't have the long run aggregate supply curve, we didn't have our target, we just had short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. When we had, say, a shift right of the short run aggregate supply curve, we could ask the question, is this sustainable growth? And the answer was, I don't know, because I don't know where my target is. I don't know where potential is. Well, our target we now have, it's here, and we moved from below our target to our target. So that is growth we can keep, okay? So that is one of the two types of sustainable growth. But again, we've really already covered this one. We covered this back in chapter 9. A move from below full employment equilibrium to full employment equilibrium, okay? Now let's talk about the second type of growth, and that is growth in potential GDP, increases in the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, what will increase long run aggregate supply? What will increase potential? Well, we've studied this as well. Increases in resources. Okay? Increases in resources. What were our resources? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Okay? Increases in these things will lead to increases in potential GDP. Right? Now, sometimes people say, I think your book might even say, increase resources or improve technology. Well, yeah, but technology is included here under resources, right? It's either included under capital once we produce the new technology, or it's under human capital, which would be under labor, if we're talking about an idea that's being developed. Okay? So increases in land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Remember, most of these are either directly or indirectly related to people, so in general, more people means we're going to produce more. And if we had more people, there'd be more entrepreneurs. But really, the most important thing for entrepreneurship is the incentives, right? We won't have entrepreneurs if we don't have a rule of law, if we don't have protection of private property rights, if we don't have tax structures that support the idea of entrepreneurs, those catalysts for putting these other resources together. If we don't promote entrepreneurship, okay, that's what drives our economy. Okay, so those things we talked about at the very beginning, okay, are particularly important to get entrepreneurs to participate in an economy. Okay, rule of law, protection of private property rights, and the right incentives. Okay. All right, so graphically, what does this look like? I'm going to reorient my paper here a little bit, but got price level here, quantity of real GDP here, and we'll have our long-run aggregate supply, 0. With it, there will be some short-run aggregate supply, 0. And then let's say there's some increase in resources, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, or it could even just be an improvement in incentives for our existing resources, okay? You know, the recent riots in Seattle and in Portland, even Louisville, I would certainly be hesitant to open up a new business in the downtowns of those areas, especially in Portland and Seattle, where it seemed like the rule of law was not going to be enforced. People were just allowed to torch businesses or loot and steal. Again, I'd look to open my business somewhere else. Okay, but again, if we improve those situations, if we increase our resources, okay, then we should see the long-run aggregate supply curve shift, right, to the right. This is increase potential GDP, right? This is QN, we'll call it QN0. Here's QN1. And remember, whenever the long-run aggregate supply curve moves, the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to move with it. Right? Remember, what were the shift factors for long-run aggregate supply? Changes in potential. Right? What were the shift factors for short-run aggregate supply? Changes in nominal input prices or changes in potential. Right? So when potential GDP goes up, the long-run and the short-run aggregate supply curve shift to the right. Okay? And that's the second type of sustainable growth. Okay? An actual movement of the of potential GDP. Now, obviously, we would like our AD to intersect right here in time period 0, right? We'd want our AD curve here in time period 0, and our AD curve here in time period 1, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with my next discussion, but this is the second type of sustainable growth and potential. That's growth we can keep, okay? Now, I want to use a graph similar to this for our next discussion, and that is a slowdown versus a recession. Sometimes students, when they use some of these models, can tend to be fooled by their simplicity and think, well, wait a minute, you know, I know that recessions don't happen all the time. Okay, does any shift left of the AD curve cause a recession? No. Does any shift left of the short and aggregate supply curve cause a recession if we're already at full employment? No. Okay, they might cause what we just call a slowdown. Okay, so let me show you a graph. Let me reorient my page again and show you a graph. And this graph is going to be very complicated and it's going to be very messy. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is you're not going to have to replicate it. Okay, you can just use, and I'll show you in a minute how to do it, but you can just use the model we've used all along to show exactly the same thing, as long as you understand what's going on in the background. Okay, so let me draw a graph here. So here's the quantity of real GDP. This is the price level. And let's say we start here. And I'm going to make this for some artificial country. Let's say the People's Republic of Bob, okay? This is the economy for the People's Republic of Bob, okay? So just some made-up country, okay? So we got the economy for the People's Republic of Bob, and it's going to look something like this, okay? Here is our long-run aggregate supply curve. Let's say this is the long-run aggregate supply curve for, let's say, again, I don't want you to confuse it with what's going on in the United States right now. So let's say this is the economy for the People's Republic of Bob in 1997. Okay, whatever that means. Okay, and let's say this is where the short-run aggregate supply curve was in 1997. Okay, and here's where the AD curve was in 1997. So good for the People's Republic of Bob. They had a price level of P0, and here's their QN for 1997. So this is the, I should put just 1997. There's P for 1997, and here's QN for 1997, but that equals their Q, their actual Q, we'll call it Q0 for 1997. Okay? Now, from year to year to year, okay, in an economy, we experience what's called typical growth, okay? So in the People's Republic of Bob, just like any economy, from year to year, we get typical growth. What does that mean? Well, we're going to see increases in resources, generally, okay? Right? Because usually there's more people. Right? That means more labor. Has more minds acquiring human capital, etc. Okay? And so we're going to see an increase in the long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply from year to year to year. Remember we said typical growth in the United States, typical growth and potential is about 3 to 5%. So let's say here is the long-run aggregate supply for 1998 if they get typical growth. I'll put TG, okay? And here is the short-run aggregate supply for People's Republic of Bob in 1998 with typical growth. And again, you're also going to have not just more resources, but because you have more people, you're going to see increases in aggregate demand, right? More people want more stuff, right? There's more people. Okay? So that's going to also increase aggregate demand typically. So from year to year to year, we typically see aggregate demand increase as well. So there's AD for 1998 that we would expect with typical growth. That's what's expected. Okay? So we're right here. And this is the price level for 1998 that we would expect. Okay? With typical growth. And here's QN for 1998. And that's what we would expect for our quantity. We'll call that Q 1998 expected. All right? So from year to year to year, right? What do we say happens in the United States? About 2% growth in prices, right? And 3 to 5% growth in potential. Okay? So there we go. That's what would happen if we experienced typical growth in the People's Republic of Ball. We'd move from this point to this point. But let's say, you know, due to certain news stories or you know, rumors or whatever, people anticipate that there could be some problems with the economy. Let's say consumer confidence drops. Okay? Well, if consumer confidence drops, people will probably spend less, right? Because they might want to save in case there's some type of problem. So here's where aggregate demand would be with typical growth. But let's say people are a little bit spooked, there's a little bit of a downturn in consumer confidence. We might not get aggregate demand all the way to here. We might only get it to here. So I'm going to call this AD 1998 actual. Right? So maybe we get, and this wouldn't have to be, but this is the price level for 1998 actual, right? So the prices don't really change much. And this is Q 1998 actual. All right? Now, do you see what happened? This was the quantity for 1997, actually. This is the actual level of real GDP in 1998. What happened? The economy grew. But maybe it only grew at that like 1.5% we were talking about we experienced after 2008, right? This is what we would call a slowdown. We were expecting, say, 3% growth, and we got 1.5% growth, or something like that. This would be right here. That would be a slowdown. The shift of aggregate demand from what we expected to here caused the economy to slow down. For it to have caused a recession, it would have had to have been a much larger shift left of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? Something like this. Okay? In fact, I could draw it out. If this is my short-run aggregate supply curve, I could just extend that, right? And aggregate demand would have to be here. This would have to be AD actual for 1998. And then where's the intersection? Right here. This would have to be Q actual for 1998. And then what happened? Here's 1997. Here's 1998. We actually see a decrease in real GDP. That's a recession, a decrease in real GDP. AD would have had to shift all the way here for a recession. If it only shifted to here, we would call that a slowdown. So this is a recession. Okay? And this is a slowdown. All right? Again, if we assume typical growth from year to year to year, a small decrease in aggregate demand will just cause a slowdown. It won't actually cause real GDP to be lower than it was the year before. It would take a very large decrease in aggregate demand for it to cause a recession. Okay? Now, I will probably ask a question like this on the exam, but I'm not going to ask you to draw the graph. And you don't even have to draw, even though I wouldn't give you points for the graph, you wouldn't even have to draw this type of graph to figure out the answer. You can use the model that we've always used. So let me just kind of show you how to do that quickly, okay? So just use the old model to answer the typical growth question, okay? So let's say I say something like, assume typical growth what will happen if there's a small decrease in aggregate demand? Well, just draw your model, okay? Aggregate demand is going to drop, so shift aggregate demand to the left. There's 81. Label your new prices, say P1, Q1. And now you have to answer the question. But just realize, oh yeah, he said assume typical growth. So this decrease in Q1 doesn't have to be a recession. It could just be a slowdown. So real GDP could actually be going up, but just not as fast as we anticipated because we're assuming typical growth. Although this looks like the price level went down, it could be the case that prices still even went up. They just didn't go up as fast as they would have had we not experienced this small decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I might ask one question along those lines where, again, probably only one or two, but again, I'll say something like, assume typical growth, what happens if the following happens? And there'll be some type of change in aggregate demand or short in aggregate supply, most likely a decrease because we're talking about recessions versus slowdowns. And you could say, okay, well, this won't necessarily cause real GDP to go down like my model says, right? It just means it'll slow down. This doesn't necessarily mean prices will go down like my model says. It just means the rate of growth in prices will be slower. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. You can just use the same old model we've been using to answer that type of question. All right? All right, the last thing we're going to cover in this chapter, just briefly, is what we call new growth theory. Okay? New growth theory. Well, what's new growth theory? Well, if there's a new growth theory, there must be an old growth theory. And although we didn't really call it old growth theory, what it was what we would call classical growth theory. Okay? So what was old growth theory? What was classical growth theory? Well, it was this idea that you needed increases in labor or increases in capital to get increases in potential. Now, again, this was formulated a while back. You might say, well, what about entrepreneurship? We could just include that with labor. What about land? Yeah, we could just include that here under capital, okay? But again, increases in resources lead to increased potential GDP. But classical growth theory treated technology, new technology, inventions, as not something you could increase. The terminology they used was technology is exogenous. What does that mean, exogenous? It means outside the model. Okay? You can't really increase technology because you don't know when a new technology is going to appear, right? You can't plan for new technology. These new inventions often surprise us. Okay? Well, then comes along an economist by the name of Paul Romer, and he posited what was called new growth theory. Okay? And things don't change. I mean, you still can't plan for technology per se, but you can increase the chances of new technology, and new technology is important for economic growth, by increased research and development. Okay? It's kind of along these lines. Catching a fish is a random event, right? You can think of a new technology like catching a fish, okay? Well, catching a fish is a random event. You can't plan on it, okay? You can't plan on it. But if you go fishing and you take along one fishing pole, are you guaranteed to catch a fish? No. What if you bring along 15 poles and you put them every 10 feet along the shoreline? Have you increased your chances of catching a fish? Yes, you have. Are you guaranteed to catch a fish? No. Okay? So you can increase your chances of finding a new technology by investing in research and development, but it doesn't guarantee you a new technology. And you might say, well, you know, why is that distinction important? Well, because it could affect policy. If you hold this view, the old growth view, you might say, well, listen, you know, technology is a completely random event. I'm not going to worry about it. Just spend money on increased labor, increased capital. Okay? But if you adopt this new growth theory, which again most economists have, okay, you say, no, wait a minute, this might be a good idea. Increase spending on research and development. Okay? And in fact, Paul Romer would suggest that we should water the green spots. What the heck does that mean? Well, you know, if you have a lawn, you typically want to water the brown spots, right? The green spots are doing fine. Well, what this means is, listen, if we have technologies that show promise, then maybe that's where we should put our money, okay? If a new technology shows promise, well, maybe that's where we should spend our money, okay? For instance, we've shown a lot of therapeutic options for lots of diseases using adult stem cells, okay? Fetal stem cells are not just a controversy because they come from aborted fetal tissue, but they've also shown no real therapeutic value. So taking the moral aspect aside, why should we even have this moral argument? Because it's not a very useful therapeutic. So let's water the green spots. Let's put our research and development into therapeutics developed through completely morally illicit adult stem cells. Okay, it's that type of approach. Okay. All right. So again, I told you this would be a little bit of a shorter chapter. So we're done with chapter 17. And again, although this is a shorter chapter and it certainly won't make up the lion's share of your next quiz or the lion's share of your next test. In many ways, it's probably one of the most important topics to reflect on in terms of policy, okay? Again, I would come back to what we said at the very beginning, okay? And that is economic growth is not inevitable. It's not our birthright. There are conditions that make economic growth more likely, and there are conditions that make economic growth less likely, okay? And so policy is going to make a huge difference in whether or not your standard of living increases over your working lifetime or remains relatively stagnant. All right? And we'll stop there for today. We'll talk to you all later. God bless.